The voicemail was 43 seconds long. I know because I transcribed it. That is what I do for a living. I take the things people say when they think the record doesn't exist, and I put them on paper, in ink, in a format that holds up in court. I am a forensic accountant. I have spent 14 years reconstructing the financial lives of people who believed their paper trail had been buried. I find the number. I always find the number. The number that night was 9:17 p.m. That was the timestamp on the voicemail my father left me. 43 seconds. 11 sentences. Not one of them mentioned what he had just inherited from the woman whose casserole dishes I was still holding in a box in my car. That is what this story is actually about. Not the voicemail. The casserole dishes. Welcome back to Calm Revenge Tales, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that silence has a ledger. If you've ever been the person who showed up, paid, absorbed, and fixed, and then been handed an invoice you never agreed to sign, this one is for you. Drop a comment and subscribe. Let's begin. My name, for the purposes of this channel, is Claire. I have been a forensic accountant for 14 years, which means I understand something most people prefer not to think about. Every relationship has a financial structure underneath it, whether anyone named it or not. Money doesn't reveal character. It confirms it. By the time I'm called into a case, the character was always already there. I am simply the person who puts the decimal points in the right place. I say this not to sound cold, but to be honest about what I see when I look at a family. I see flows. I see who the money moved toward and who it moved away from. I see which accounts grew and which were quietly drained. I see the moment in the ledger where something changed, and I ask, what happened that week? I grew up in a house with 3 other people, my father, my stepmother Renata, and my half-brother Marcus, who was 9 years younger than me and had never, as far as I could tell, been told the word no in any language. My mother had died when I was 11. A car accident, 2 weeks before Christmas, which is the kind of sentence that stops conversations, and so I have learned to say it plainly. My father remarried when I was 15. Renata was not unkind to me. She was simply clear, in the way people are clear when they have made a decision and prefer not to discuss it, that her primary investment was Marcus. I understood the terms without anyone explaining them. I became, over the following years, quietly self-sufficient. I finished school on academic scholarships. I paid for my own graduate program. I sent my father a handwritten card on his birthday every year for 22 years. He called me on mine maybe a third of the time. I noted this. I did not say anything. Some debts, I assumed, simply were not meant to be collected. What I did not know, until 11 months ago, was that my grandmother had noticed. My grandmother, my father's mother Meredith, was 81 years old, sharp as a court filing, and deeply unimpressed by Renata. She had never said this out loud. She didn't have to. She showed it in how she spent her Saturdays, with me. Every other week for the last 12 years, I drove 40 minutes to her house, and we ate the same lunch. Tomato soup, grilled cheese with the crusts cut off. And she asked me questions about my work that demonstrated she had actually read what I sent her. She called forensic accounting following the money until it confesses. That was Meredith. She died on a Thursday in March. Quietly in her own bed, which is how she had intended to go. She had told me so. I was the one who answered the hospice's call at 6 a.m. I was the one who drove to her house. I was the one who sat with the funeral home director for 2 hours that morning, making the arrangements she had already pre-selected and prepaid, because she was that kind of woman. My father arrived at noon. Renata and Marcus arrived the following day. They had been at a resort in Scottsdale. I have the checkout timestamp. They checked out the morning after my grandmother died. I did not say anything about that. I carried out 7 boxes of her things. The casserole dishes were in the last one. The dinner was my father's idea. 2 weeks after the funeral, he called and said we should all sit down together, as a family, and he named a restaurant that Meredith had never liked and that none of us could afford without thinking about it. I said yes. I drove 40 minutes. I arrived first. Renata was dressed as though she were attending something celebratory. Marcus was on his phone. My father looked at me when I sat down the way people look at a problem they've been hoping will solve itself. We ordered. We made the conversation that people make. And then around the point when the entrees arrived, my father put down his fork and said, "Claire, we need to talk about the house." Meredith's house. He said it simply, as though we were already in the middle of a conversation. As though the subject had been established. As though we all knew the outcome, and were simply exchanging the paperwork. He said, "Your grandmother would have wanted the house to stay in the family. Marcus is in a position where he could use it. We're thinking it makes sense to have him move in. Renata will help with the transition." I said, "What does the will say?" The table went quiet in the particular way that tables go quiet when someone has said the wrong word. In my experience, the wrong word is usually just the accurate one. My father said, "Claire, this is a family matter. We don't need to make it legal." I said, "The will is a legal document. That's different from making something legal. What does it say?" He said he hadn't spoken to the attorney yet. They were going to handle it internally first. I picked up my fork. I said, "Of course. Let me know what you find out." The dinner continued. And then about 20 minutes later, I had not ordered dessert. I was folding my napkin, my father said. "Also, we're going to need the things you took from the house. The boxes. Meredith's casserole dishes. Her sewing kit. The 2 framed photographs of my mother that Meredith had kept on her mantle, because she said my mother had been a woman worth keeping visible. The recipe box with 40 years of index cards in her handwriting. The small blue journal I had seen her writing in every single visit for 12 years. He said, "Renata thinks it would be better if the personal items stayed together with the house. As a set." I looked at Renata. Renata looked at her water glass. I said, "I'll look into it." He said, "Claire, I need you to understand. This is how your grandmother would have wanted it." I set down my napkin. I said, "I knew her pretty well." I stood up. I said it was lovely to see them. I hoped the rest of dinner was wonderful, and I walked out. The voicemail came at 9:17 p.m. 43 seconds. He said I had embarrassed the family. He said I had always made everything about myself. He said I had taken things that didn't belong to me. He said, and I am reading from my own transcription now, word for word. "Don't come back until you're ready to be part of this family." I saved the audio file. I transcribed it. I put it in a folder I labeled with the date. Then I sat at my kitchen table with the blue journal in my hands, and I did not open it. Not yet. I held it the way you hold something you know will change the shape of what you understand, and you want one more minute before the shape changes. The habit of 14 years. Document first. Feel later. The call from the attorney's office came at 8:52 the next morning. His name was Gerald Ashworth. He had been Meredith's estate attorney for 19 years. He called me directly, which I noted. "Not my father." He said, "Miss Claire, I'm calling because you are named as the executor of your grandmother's estate, and we need to schedule a time to go over the documents." I said, "I'm sorry, executor?" He said, "Yes. Your grandmother updated her estate plan 14 months ago. She was very specific about who she wanted in that role." I drove to his office the following Tuesday. I sat in a chair across a mahogany desk. He placed a copy of the will in front of me and gave me a moment to read the first page. I am a forensic accountant. I read documents for a living. I read this one 3 times before I said a word. The house was not going to Marcus. The house, a 3-bedroom craftsman in a zip code that had appreciated significantly over the last 12 years, currently valued at $420,000, had been placed in a revocable living trust. The trust named me as the sole beneficiary. There was a contingency clause. If I predeceased her, the house would go to a hospice organization she had supported for years. Marcus was not mentioned in the trust. Marcus was not mentioned in the will. My father received a single item, a framed photograph of his parents on their wedding day. Meredith had written a note in the margin of the document, in her own hand, initialed and dated. He already received his portion. See attached. Gerald Ashworth slid a second document across the desk. It was a promissory note, signed by my father, dated 9 years ago. He had borrowed $87,000 from Meredith. The note included an interest schedule. At the time of her death, the outstanding balance, with interest, was $104,000. The will directed the executor, me, to treat this as a debt of the estate, collectible before any distribution. I put the page down. I picked it up again. I read the promissory note one more time, slowly, starting with the signature line, which had my father's name in his own handwriting, and a notary seal dated November 4th, 9 years ago. Gerald Ashworth said quietly, "There's one more thing she wanted you to have." He placed a sealed envelope on the desk. My name was written on the front in Meredith's handwriting. I did not open it there. I thanked Gerald Ashworth. I asked him to please send me the full trust document and all supporting instruments. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened the envelope. The letter was one page, handwritten, dated 6 weeks before she died. She said she was sorry she hadn't told me sooner. She said she had watched me carry things for 20 years that were never mine to carry. She said she had made one decision she was proud of. She had written it down, signed it, and made it binding, so that no one could stand over a dinner table and simply declare that things were otherwise. At the bottom, she had written one line, underlined twice. "Quiet is not the same as agreeing." I read that line 4 times. Then I closed the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope inside the blue journal and set it on my kitchen counter, where I could see it from every room. If you have ever watched people who couldn't find one free afternoon suddenly discover a very flexible schedule the moment there was property involved, you already know where this is going. And if you've ever had someone tell you what a dead woman would have wanted, while her ink was still drying on a document that said something different, stay with me. This is the part where the receipts come out. My father called 4 times in the 2 weeks after the dinner. I did not answer. He left 2 more voicemails. I transcribed both. The second one mentioned, casually, that they had already started talking to a contractor about the house. I noted the date. I noted the phrase. Renata texted me a photograph of a paint color swatch. No kapskin. Marcus called once, at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. He said, and I am reading from my notes, "We just want to make sure we're all on the same page, because Dad says there might be some confusion about the house and we just want to get ahead of it." He used the phrase "get ahead of it" twice in the same sentence. He was 26 years old and had never, as far as I knew, been ahead of anything. I called Gerald Ashworth the next morning. I said, "Send the letters." He sent 3. One to my father, as a debtor of the estate, notifying him of the outstanding balance on the promissory note. $104,000, payable within 60 days per the terms of the note, or subject to legal collection proceedings. One to my father and Renata, as occupants of no legal standing, notifying them that any entry onto the property at 414 Meredith Lane without written consent of the executor constituted trespass. One to a contractor, because Gerald had his name and phone number, because Meredith had installed a security system 2 years ago and the camera had a timestamp, notifying him that no work had been authorized on that property, and that any work performed without authorization of the executor would not be compensated. I had been standing in my kitchen when Gerald read me that last letter for my approval. I was looking at the blue journal on the counter. Calm is not the same as weak. My family had confused the two my entire life, and the confusion had for 20 years been very profitable for them. My father called 7 minutes after receiving the letter. I answered this time. He said, "What the hell is this?" I said, "It's a legal notice from the estate." He said, "You had no right." I said, "I'm the executor, Dad. It's literally the right. What did you want to talk about?" The call lasted 9 minutes. He said I was selfish. He said I was punishing him for not being a perfect father. He said Meredith would be devastated by what I was doing. He said she would have wanted 3 more times. I counted. 3. I said. She left a document. I have read it. Have you? He said he didn't need a piece of paper to know his own mother's wishes. I said, I know. That's the difference between us. He hung up. 3 days later, they called a family dinner. Not a restaurant this time. Renata's sister's house, which I found interesting. A house with a dining room table large enough for 8 people and the acoustics of a stage. My aunt by marriage. My father's oldest friends, Doug and Patricia, who had known me since I was 12. My cousin Bethany, who was the sort of person who filmed things on her phone and called it staying informed. The invitation came from Renata. The subject line of the email was, "Family matters that need resolution." I replied, "I'll be there." 6 o'clock? She wrote back within 4 minutes, "Yes. Please come ready to listen." I wrote back, "I'll bring my folder." She did not reply to that. I arrived at 5:58. I was the first guest to be seated. I set my folder on the chair beside me, which I had pulled slightly apart from the table, and I folded my hands and waited. My father sat at the head of the table, Renata at his left, Marcus beside her, Doug and Patricia across from me, looking slightly uncertain in the way people look when they've arrived at what they thought was a dinner, and realized it is a proceeding. My aunt, Renata's sister, Carol, brought out a cheese plate and the room relaxed slightly. That is the function of a cheese plate, to make people believe the gathering is social. My father stood up. He cleared his throat. He said, "I appreciate everyone being here. We're family. And when there are disagreements in a family, the right thing to do is to handle them together, as a family, not through lawyers and paperwork." He looked at me when he said lawyers and paperwork. I looked back. He continued. He said Meredith had been a wonderful woman who loved all of her grandchildren. He gestured to Marcus, and would never have wanted any one of them to be excluded from her legacy. He said there were documents that may have created some confusion. He said he thought, as a family, they should agree to handle this equitably, which he defined as Marcus in the house, a sum of money, he named a figure, $40,000, to be paid to me from the eventual sale of various items, and the promissory note to be considered settled in the spirit of forgiveness. He said in the spirit of forgiveness, like it was a gift he was presenting to me. He sat down. Renata touched his hand. Marcus said, "We're not trying to be unfair, Claire. We're just trying to be realistic." I said, "Can I have a moment to respond?" My father said yes. The table waited. Bethany's phone appeared above the table edge, and then disappeared again. Doug coughed. I opened the folder. I said, "I want to start with the promissory note." I placed a copy in the center of the table. I slid it forward. I said, "This is a legally executed promissory note, signed by you, notarized, dated 9 years ago. $104,000, with interest, outstanding at the time of Meredith's death. Gerald Ashworth has sent you a copy. This is mine." My father said, "That was a family arrangement. That was between me and my mother." I said, "It has a notary seal and an interest schedule. That's a loan, not an arrangement." I paused. The second document. I placed a copy of the trust instrument on the table. I said, "This is the revocable living trust, signed 14 months ago, witnessed by 2 individuals and filed with the county. The property at 414 Meredith Lane is held in this trust. The sole named beneficiary is me. This document was prepared by an attorney with 19 years of relationship with your mother. It was not confusion." Renata said, "She was 81. She wasn't always." I said, "She was assessed by her physician 4 months before this document was signed, and found to be fully competent. Gerald has that documentation as well. I can have him send it to you if you'd like." The table was quiet. My father said, his voice lower now, "Claire, she was your grandmother, not your client." I said, "She was both. She asked me to help her understand the documents she was signing." I sat at her kitchen table with a copy of the trust instrument, and I read every clause with her. She asked good questions. She made 2 changes. One of them was to add a provision protecting the personal property from claims by other parties. I looked at him. She was thinking of the casserole dishes. Bethany put her phone away. I noticed that. Doug said very quietly, Bill. That was my father's name. Bill. And Doug said it in a way that meant, stop. My father looked at Doug. Something passed between them that I did not entirely understand, but I recognized its shape. It was the shape of a man realizing the room has changed. Marcus said, This is insane. You're really going to do this over a house? I said, The house is $420,000. That's not an abstraction. That's a number. Marcus said, We're family. I said, Yes, we are. I reached into the folder one more time. I placed the last item on the table. Not a document. A photograph. It was a photograph I had found in the blue journal. Tucked between 2 pages, unframed, taken at a backyard birthday party. My mother was in it. I was 7. Meredith was standing behind us both with her hand on my mother's shoulder. And they were both laughing at something off camera. On the back in Meredith's handwriting, Claire and her mother. Keep visible. She had written keep visible. She had used the imperative. I had kept it. I left it on the table. I said. She wrote a letter. The last line said, Quiet is not the same as agreeing. I have been quiet about a lot of things for a long time. I'm going to stop doing that now. I closed the folder. I picked up the photograph and put it in my bag. I said goodnight to Doug and Patricia. I thanked Carol for the cheese. I walked out. My father did not follow me. The 60-day notice on the promissory note expired without payment. Gerald Ashworth filed a claim against my father's estate interest. He had inherited a small investment account from Meredith's estate as a co-beneficiary on a separate instrument, worth approximately $62,000. The court offset the debt. My father received nothing from Meredith's estate after the offset, and the remaining balance of $42,000 was recorded as an unsatisfied judgment. It will follow him. The house at 414 Meredith Lane passed to me through the trust 30 days after her death, without probate because that is what trusts are designed to do. I had the locks changed. I hired an inspector. I sat on the porch for 1 hour on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee, and I looked at the yard she had kept for 40 years, and I let myself understand that it was mine. Marcus moved into an apartment 20 minutes away. His parents are paying the rent. I know this because people talk, and I listen, and I do not consider it my problem. Renata sent one text 3 weeks after the dinner. It said, I hope you're happy. I did not respond. I noted the date. Bethany called me, unexpectedly, on a Thursday. She said she was sorry. She said she had not known about the promissory note. She said she remembered my mother. Actually, she was 5 when she died. But she remembered the casseroles she used to bring to family gatherings. She cried a little. I thanked her for calling. I did not tell her it changed anything. It didn't. But I told her the truth. Meredith had remembered my mother too. That she had kept photographs. That she had written it down. Bethany said, God, she was something. I said, she really was. Doug called too. He said, I've known your father for 40 years. I want you to know that what he said in that voicemail. I'm sorry you heard that. I asked him how he knew about the voicemail. He said my father had played it for him once, apparently proud of it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, Thank you for calling, Doug. The blue journal is on my bookshelf now, between 2 volumes on estate law. I have not read all of it. I've read some pages. She wrote about her garden, about her late husband, about a recipe she was trying to perfect. She wrote about me sometimes, not dramatically, just the way you write about someone you see clearly. Claire came today. She brought tulips. She asked me about the Hendricks case she's working on, and I made her explain the whole thing because it was interesting. She stayed an extra hour. She didn't have to. She was documenting us. Of course she was. I used the rental income from 414 Meredith Lane. I leased it to a young woman named Dara, who is finishing her nursing degree and needed a quiet place, to establish a small annual scholarship at the community college in Meredith's name, for students studying accounting or finance. It is not a large sum. It is not meant to be a monument. It is simply the right thing to do with money that flows from someone who understood that numbers are a form of care. The casserole dishes are in my cabinet. I have used them twice. Once for a friend's new baby. Once for myself, on a Sunday alone with the window open and a podcast playing. Because I live in my grandmother's memory now and I intend to make it feel lived in. My father has not called. I have not called him. I think sometimes about the 43-second voicemail. About the phrase "don't come back until you're ready to be part of this family." I turn it over the way you turn over a phrase that was meant to wound you and find, instead, that it has become a kind of instruction. I didn't go back. I wasn't ready. He was right about the first part. He had the rest of it wrong. I was already part of a family. It was just the one she built, on paper, in her own hand, witnessed and notarized, 14 months before she died. She knew what she was doing. She did it quietly. Quiet is not the same as agreeing. And it is not the same as doing nothing. Sometimes quiet is the thing you do while you are building something no one can take back. If this story reminded you that a person can love you loudly and document it quietly, and that the document outlasts the loudness, take that with you. If there's a relationship in your life running on a ledger you never agreed to, you are allowed to close the account. You're allowed to keep the casserole dishes. You're allowed to be the one who reads everything twice and says calmly, "That's not what it says." Update what needs updating. The paperwork is simpler than the feelings, and it lasts longer than both. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.